All right, Evan, all of a sudden, VP Harris, everywhere, all at once, she's talking to vastly different audiences, from Call Her Daddy to The View to Howard Stern to Stephen Colbert. What do you make of the Republican arguments that it's only to friendly viewers? She went on 60 Minutes last night, and Republicans jumped all over it, saying she did a terrible job.
Well, I mean, Donald Trump decided not to go on 60 Minutes and take those tough questions. I mean, look, Vice President Harris is doing a general election strategy that makes a lot of sense, right? You speak to a broad number of voters, where you find them, things like that podcast you mentioned. That's a thing that has a huge audience of people, young women specifically who Harris needs to speak to. This is what you're used to seeing from a presidential candidate this time of year. Donald Trump is spending most of his time talking to conservative audiences, which is less normal for this time of year for this general election campaign. So I don't really see anything too surprising about the vice president, getting out as much as she can anywhere she can right now.
But there is a double standard, Jonathan, right? All the media pressure on VP Harris. Last year, Joe Biden skipped the Super Bowl interview, and he got absolutely crushed for it. Mm-hmm. How come when Donald Trump skipped 60 Minutes, a 50-year-old tradition, nobody blinks?
Well, I think that there should be more coverage of Trump for not doing 60 Minutes, for not doing a debate in October, and for, mostly doing sort of home team interviews on a different cable network. That said, let's go back, though. I mean, if Biden was facing questions about his capacity to run for re-election and serve 4.5 more years as president, and was doing very little TV interviews at the time. And I think that's the reason why Biden faced questions about why won't you do even the Super Bowl interview, which is kind of a layup interview with a huge audience. I think it was the context of the moment that mattered then. That's water under the bridge now. But I think at the time, the issue was Biden having to prove his capacity to serve for 4.5 more years, a question that, by the way, in hindsight, turned out to be a pretty damn good one.
Fair. David, let's talk about Bob Woodward's book, which says that Donald Trump sent COVID tests to Vladimir Putin for his personal use during the pandemic, the height of the pandemic. And since leaving office, Trump and Putin have spoke a whole bunch of times. How can any voter believe that Donald Trump would stand up to Putin and put the American people first when you learn something like that?
Well, I don't know if you need to learn something like that to question whether or not the former president's going to stand up to Putin if he's reelected and in office again. I think what's really interesting here is if these reports are true, the United States is leading the effort to help Ukraine defend itself against Russia's unprovoked invasion. And here you have a former president who has questioned the level of support the United States is giving to Kyiv, speaking to Vladimir Putin, who is a major adversary of the United States. So that in and of itself, I think, is the more newsworthy aspect of this. The former president was always very tight with Putin in a way that he would not allow himself to be tight with other autocrats. And that's just something we already know. But this other piece of information, really puts into question how he would function if reelected, given he would take over a government that has been aiding Ukraine by the billions. And the stated policy has been, we're helping Ukraine win and not just end the war. And it looks like something that the former president has been preparing for some time.
Jonathan, should voters be paying a lot more attention to that? Traditionally, foreign policy does not rank as a top priority for the average American voter. But given what David just laid out, it kind of seems like it should be.
Yeah, and I think there's a certain kind of voter that I'm thinking of that David's quite familiar with, because I think some of the readers at the Dispatch are in this category, which are people who cannot abide the thought of voting for Donald Trump, but are not quite sure that they can get there to pull the lever for Kamala Harris. And right now they're thinking about, maybe I skip the top line, or perhaps write somebody in. I don't know if I can vote for somebody as liberal as Harris. Boy, I think with that kind of voter, especially the more intellectually curious and frankly sophisticated voter in that category, the Putin story to me is enormously helpful because that's what the alternative is to Kamala Harris. It's a binary choice, and if you're not voting for Kamala Harris, you're effectively helping somebody who's got a really cozy relationship with one of the worst authoritarian leaders in the world right now. And I think that's the question that these voters, hundreds of thousands of them, who were kind of traditional Republicans, Stephanie, probably voted for George W. Bush, what do? Can they bring themselves to actually vote for Harris? And not just about opposing Trump, but actually voting affirmatively for Harris. And I think that story about Putin is the kind of thing that will speak to that demographic.
Edwin, when I close my eyes and I think about the profile of the voter that Jonathan just laid out, the picture of Mitt Romney comes to mind. And we just learned it yet again today. I heard it a few months ago when I interviewed him. Mitt Romney does not plan to endorse VP Kamala Harris. Does that surprise you in any way? Given exactly the person, the profile Jonathan just laid out, it's Mitt.
Well, I'm not sure that the Harris campaign is too concerned about Romney's endorsement specifically. They picked up a lot of Republican endorsements, specifically along the lines of the ones that Jonathan was talking about. I will say that we've had some reporting in Notice recently. My colleague Jasmine Wright went out to Arizona and really did a story about how important this electorate is to Harris in some of these swing states, especially that swing state. This is a state where the math has changed, and it's more Republican than it was in 2020 when Joe Biden won it. And now the campaign in Arizona, it really needs these Republicans who don't like Trump to not just hold their nose and not vote for a president, but to vote for her. And they're doing some active steps to try to make that happen. But it is kind of an uphill climb. It's a very tough thing to ask anybody to do. And this is sort of the biggest challenge that she's facing right now.
David, Donald Trump and J.D. Vance jumped on VP Harris's comment that she couldn't think of anything she would do differently than President Biden. But why does she need to make an argument that she's the change candidate? The knock on Biden was not his policies, it was his age.
Well, that's not exactly true. A lot of voters, particularly in the swing states, were really upset with the president's leadership on the economy. Inflation in particular rankled them, and it had them rethinking how they thought about Trump and almost memory holing the pandemic. And when you are running as the change candidate, even though Vice President Harris has a good case to make there, and as you pointed out with the New York Times poll, she has sort of reclaimed that mantle, at least in that poll. When you're given that kind of a question, you want to give voters the idea, even if Harris wasn't in this position necessarily, even if President Biden's numbers were hovering just under 50 as opposed to just above 40, that you're going to be a different kind of leader. Now, she has indicated that in so much of the way that she has operated this campaign and the policies that she's proposed, in the way that she's going after the Republican vote. But it's the kind of thing when you're posed the question, you want to answer it in a better way than she did as a matter of politics.
Yes, but the reason people weren't feeling great about the economy 6 months ago when they were asked about it under President Biden, it's because interest rates were higher and inflation was worse. Both of those things have changed without her offering dramatically different policy solutions.
Yeah, but prices have not yet gone down. They will over time, and the interest rate drop and the cooling of inflation is a really big deal, and you're right to point that out. You talk to voters in the swing states, as I have been doing, as Jonathan does, as we all have, and prices still rankle them. Now, look, Vice President Harris leads in most of the polls, but this thing is a coin flip. I'm in Pennsylvania. I've been talking to Republicans and Democrats for the past few days, as I will for the rest of the week, as I travel with my colleague from west to east, from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia. And everybody is working hard on the ground on the Democratic side. They feel cautiously optimistic, but they tell me it's a coin flip and not something in which they feel comfortably ahead.
Understood, though, of course, Donald Trump has not offered a single policy solution that would lower prices. Jonathan, today on The View, VP Harris was asked about all the lies Trump is spreading about the government's hurricane response. I want you to watch this.
Yeah.
What do you think the effect of these lies are, and why is he doing this?
Well, it's profound, and it is the height of irresponsibility and, frankly, callousness.
Yeah.
So lives are literally at stake right now. And the idea that somebody would be playing political games for the sake of himself, but this is so consistent about Donald Trump. He puts himself before the needs of others. I fear that he really lacks empathy on a very basic level to care about the suffering of other people and then understand the role of a leader is not to beat people down, it's to lift people up.
Absolutely.
Especially in a time of crisis.
Jonathan, she may be absolutely right, but Donald Trump never promised or said he was ever going to be empathetic. He's telling these lies for a reason, and it may be deplorable, reprehensible, but will it work for him politically?
Well, this is what he knows. This is lizard brain, lowest common denominator, instinctual politics that Trump didn't discover, but obviously he's tapping into it in a really unsubtle way, which is they are taking benefits from you, deserving American, in your time of need, and they're giving them to somebody who's less deserving. It's a sort of old school demagoguery 101 type politics, and they wouldn't do it if they didn't think it worked. What's different here, I think, is that Trump tells these lies in such a sort of incredibly flamboyant and bold and frankly shameless way that, you know, it's just preposterous. And I think voters of goodwill, center right, center left, or dead center, I hear some of this stuff and find it not just fanciful, but find what he's doing to be somewhat offensive. The challenge is if folks actually believe some of this stuff and abetted by social media, which is pushing out all kinds of crap into the ether, you know, does that actually have some impact on folks who are still up for grabs voter-wise? I tend to think the people who believe what he's saying, Stephanie, 90% of them were already going to vote for Trump in the first place. If you believe that FEMA is forsaking American citizens in an hour of need for some political reason, boy, I think you are already in the MAGA column to start with.